All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Adrian Snobbery, a host of the Enterprise Security Weekly podcast and principal researcher at the Defenders Initiative. Welcome to this webcast sponsored by eCentire. Today, I'm joined by Spencer Hutchinson, staff threat intelligence researcher at eCentire. How you doing today, Spence?
I'm doing pretty good. Yourself?
I'm surviving. I was just detailing, the excitement that I'm going through today with electricians in the house. So, the internet I'm coming to you through is powered on battery backup right now. So very exciting. Perhaps not exactly the excitement you want on a day that you have to do a live webcast, but I'm glad that everything's working. And today, speaking of disruptions, we're talking about ransomware today. And folks listening to this podcast, if you have any questions, I would like to direct your attention to the blue bubbles you've got below. You should see four of them there. One of them you can just use to chat with the other attendees or with the hosts. And you can also submit a question with the third one from the left there. There's a Q&A button where you can submit questions. And you can do that whenever you like. You can do that. You don't have to save your questions until the end. I'll be checking it periodically, both the chat and the Q&A, as we go through this webcast. So feel free to drop your questions down there. And also want to direct you to that very last blue bubble where we do have some handouts for you. We've got a few links there and what looks like a few handouts as well. You can go grab those PDFs. You can download them. You can read them at any time. You can do that now. You can do it later. I'll remind you again before we end this webcast for the hour. But with that, let's get into it. All right. So, I think clearly everybody on here is going to be some level of familiar with ransomware, right, Spence? It's even folks I know that have nothing to do with cybersecurity. It's fairly mainstream. We see it in the news on a regular basis, and so I think this is probably a good place to just kind of catch people up with what ransomware is like today, and how these criminal enterprises, how these ransomware crews run. So maybe let's start with the business model there, because it seems like it's matured a whole lot since, I think we first saw ransomware 2015 through 2017, the kind of the beginnings of it.
Yeah, definitely. So I've been in this industry long enough to witness sort of the rise of ransomware from those like localized smash and grab attacks to these more mature businesses that almost mimic corporate structures that we see in legitimate business space. I would argue that the ransomware groups we face today are much more dangerous than what we had even just 5 years ago. Oftentimes we're looking at complete network takeover and lockdown of systems and data. Um, if I were to put my finger on like one key trend that I've seen with respect to cybercrime in the last few years, it's been this focus on like cybercrime as a service model. So you have your experts in particular fields like malware development, phishing, network intrusions, exploit development, etc. And they commonly they'll sell those services on underground markets in places like Telegram. And essentially they're pushing those capabilities down the skill ladder, if you will. And we get like this proliferation of more advanced capabilities across like the threat actor spectrum. I also think like the emergence of cryptocurrency has certainly made it easier for these guys to get paid as well. But when we think of cybercrime, and there's a reason why it all comes back to ransomware in many cases, is there has to be like a driver for that business. There has to be some way to make money. If I'm going to go rent malware for $500 a month, I'm going to expect some kind of return on investment, right? And that's where ransomware comes in, and that's where we see this evolution. And when you really break it down, ransomware just provides the marketplace that rewards or funds these network intrusions. So I go to kind of your second question, second part of your question around how these groups are structured. Ransomware groups today often mimic, corporate structures, if you will, by adopting these sort of layered business models. And this includes primarily the Ransomware-as-a-service model we'll talk a bit about. And that really allows them to scale and innovate. So when we think of that structure, like we have like tiered leadership within these groups, and we have a command structure to manage the operation. They'll create teams for malware development, for exploitation, for handling negotiations, and they'll have managers or leaders running those teams as well. And they'll have like KPI metrics, performance metrics that they can track to see who's doing what and who's performing well in terms of their affiliates and whatnot. And they will also contract out certain tasks to other service providers or contractors in the same way that like a traditional business would go to like a service provider. And believe it or not, they also have administrative people for public relations, for recruitment, and resolving internal conflicts. And when we think of
HR.
like how, yeah, HR teams, right? And they'll push those capabilities and those tools down to enable the affiliates that they work with. Um, we know a lot of this thanks to, in particular, a large part to some leaks that we saw with respect to the Conti ransomware group, especially their entire sort of chat network leaked at one point, and we were able to go look
Oh,
through and
interesting.
see exactly how the various operators and affiliates were interacting and sort of suss out their structure. And we also know some of this as well from like law enforcement indictment documents that have come out. So in terms of like how they scale this, it comes back to that like that cybercrime as a business. Like we see sort of this gig economy that's out there that I believe enables these cyber attacks to really scale out, because these services are pushing, I would argue, pretty advanced capabilities down to anyone with like a couple $100 to spend. So that includes like malware obfuscation or encryption. Code signing certificates can be purchased. You can rent entire malware-as-a-service platforms, phishing platforms. You can even just go purchase footholds within high value networks that you can then go and leverage for extortion. So really, it's emerged as it's evolved into this more integrated, mature business model that enables lower skilled actors to sort of jump into this kind of ecosystem and make money doing it without a ton of skill.
Right. Yeah, and it's I remember seeing that in the your annual report, which I think is one of the handouts that we have here. I was tickled the calling it a gig economy, but it is interesting to the the extent to which it does mimic normal business stuff, like you mentioned, KPIs, key performance indicators. There's metrics that they go after. It sounds like there's whole marketplaces and ecosystems, which kind of explains why even when law enforcement takes one of these groups down, they keep popping up because there's just so much support out there. There is a whole ecosystem, right? Like it's doesn't take long to set up a ransomware crew, right?
Yeah, and once that part of the problem is like it's hard to kill or like disrupt an idea, right? Once this model of running this business, if you will, is established and it's proven that it works, it's easy to replicate. And so if you take down key players in certain groups, the affiliates and the other folks that are threat actors, I should say, that are working for those groups, it's not that difficult to take all the documentation and procedures that they've picked up within that group and just go start their own thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And so, with that said, with this, maybe we can think of this as being mature at this point, right? There's, I don't think there's any aspect of a ransomware attack, that isn't documented, that hasn't been, somewhat streamlined at this point. I imagine that extends to how they set a price, right? Like when we first saw ransomware, it was very opportunistic. It would hit up individuals, for like $600 to $1,200 to decrypt their files on their PC, and then it moved to entire organizations, right? Like I remember you mentioning that it's more dangerous now than it was 5 years ago, and I imagine some of that comes from the fact that they have streamlined things. They know what works, what is more likely to get them a payment or not. And I imagine some of that is knowing how to negotiate, like where to set that price.
Yeah. Yeah, certainly. And there's some really good research by the NCC group. I'll see if I can find the link for it and we can share it here towards the end of the presentation before I forget. But essentially, like we think of like negotiation tactics. It comes down to like the standard kind of playbook that we see with ransomware groups now is double extortion. So you may hear triple extortion as well. I'm sure there's quadruple
Yeah.
extortion, but really the main two that we see are data theft and then threatening to leak that information, and then in conjunction with data encryption. When it comes to like how we should think of this as defenders, it's really important to understand the scope and impact during a ransomware incident as quickly as possible. You know, you could have, is it, if you're a multinational company, are all offices locked down, all servers locked down, or is this like just a single localized office that we have contained and we understand the scope and impact of like what has been stolen, what's been locked down, et cetera. And that is easier said than done, especially like in a crisis. But these groups will try and inflate how much leverage they have. So it's important to have your own firsthand knowledge of what did they actually get a hold of, what did they actually steal or encrypt when it comes to that negotiation. So going back to like the price that they set, um, really from what I've seen and in my experience, a lot of it comes down to some kind of basic metrics, if you will, about like you as a business. So they'll look at like your size, your revenue, what industry you're in, like what is your public footprint, and they'll use that to determine the ransom demand. And like I said, the NCC group did put out a white paper on this. It's called Ransomware Economics. If you give that a Google, and they just really drill down into like, okay, how can we create like a model for this to try and predict the value of like or set what they may truly demand as a ransom. But again, in many cases, they're going to come up with a number that's inflated or on the high end. That's based on a percentage of your revenue. And if you're wondering why they get that, they'll just take your company name and go to something like ZoomInfo and get the number from that. Funny enough, they'll use that too to pick you as a target. So when we've
But like
gone and looked
salespeople,
at
it sounds very similar to how salespeople find leads, right?
exactly right, um, when we've looked at how like these, especially malware as a service, like the panels that they use to manage their victims, or initial access brokers, and how they market the footholds that they have for sale. What are the key things they say? They say the industry that you're in or that victim is in, and their revenue size, because those are the kind of the key indicators that a affiliate or a ransomware actor is looking for to sort of leverage, because ultimately that's going to be a percentage of what they get or what they're going to ask. Um, Really, like thinking of negotiation. Ultimately, these guys want to get paid as quickly as possible during those scenarios. And there is research again, for back to that NCC article, but from others out there that shows that they are open to negotiation when that does kick off. They want this to be as quick as possible. They want to get paid and move on to the next victim, and they'll apply pressure like threatening to release stolen data or a subset of that stolen data, or even just saying we're going to name you publicly as a
Contact the
victim before you're
SEC
ready.
and telling you for not reporting your breach.
That is something that did happen, yes, funny enough, and they'll say stuff like, "We're gonna double the ransom if you don't pay by X date as well."
Yeah,
I have seen out there, like, they're willing to work, they're willing to give discounts if you ask for it, give you more time to get sorted, um, but it's funny enough, ransomware negotiator, I think, is a real job now. And
yeah.
you'll find some of those expertise within those IR firms, in particular. One thing that I want to throw out there as kind of something that's not that well known is some of these groups, they'll have a little timer basically that once they encrypt your data, they'll give you X period of time before they start releasing it, or do whatever, destroy the backups, whatever it is, or destroy the files, or whatever it is. So in some cases, that timer is initiated when you click on a link within a ransom note that's dropped on your desktop.
Oh,
So it's really
really?
important that when you're in the response phase and you're pulling up these the ransom notes, in certain cases, just clicking on that onion link can initiate that timer. So it's something we have to kind of keep working with, continuously work with, like our guys, like don't open it up uh, and
Yeah.
uh, and click on stuff, because you could kick off that timer before you're ready.
Well, it's interesting because your email security system might click that link for you, right? Like some security systems out there will go to links, to see if they're malicious or not. So yeah, I'd never considered
Awesome.
that they automate the timer being triggered off the somebody going to that link. Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah.
Very good to know. So, I wonder if the fact that they've streamlined this and they kind of have a playbook, right? They've got steps they're going to go through. And it sounds like um, maybe large portions of how they do things here are fairly automated. Does that give us a chance to disrupt them? If they're very comfortable with that kind of step one, step two. Here's how things should go. Are there opportunities there that we can find in their TTPs to maybe make things more difficult for them, or make them give up on you as a target and move on to somebody else?
100%. Yeah. So um, I would, if I were to think of like a ransomware attack, it ransomware is the final phase, right? That is the objective that they're attempting to achieve, is theft, and then like, extorting the data, or extorting access to that data. There's a there are things that have to happen before they can get to that phase. So if I were to put into like three phases at kind of a high level, I would have the foothold phase, the hands-on keyboard phase, and then ultimately the ransomware phase. So the foothold is like, some folks might I think there's a misconception that ransomware is highly targeted. We were hit because they 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 did a bunch of reconnaissance on us. They looked us up and they said, "Hey, you are the ideal target. We're going to spend a bunch of time and resources trying to infiltrate you." And I'm sure when we think of more mature groups or affiliates like Scattered Spider, they're doing a bit of that. But largely, what I see is these are initiated in an opportunistic manner. So a known exploit or vulnerability is exploited on your perimeter that you had a chance to patch, and they use that to gain a foothold and then access into your network. Phishing for credentials, or a malware foothold. Um, there's a metric that we've looked at in the past couple of years, where we track it as like the breakout time. So how long did it take a let's say malware foothold to be activated, and then we saw hands-on keyboard activity on that machine? We've seen it as quickly as under an hour, but the sort of average is more like days to weeks. So you certainly have a chance to identify and contain that foothold, and sort of kick them out before they're able to activate it, and
If
start
you're
trying to
aware of it.
if you're aware of it. Yeah. And that's,
Yeah.
we think of like some of the victims and who is most victimized by ransomware. It's oftentimes these small to medium sized businesses that, I think there's a correlation there with respect to their capability or ability to like, uh, not just identify but contain that initial sort of foothold before they're able to elevate their access. So, uh, yeah, I mean, in terms of like what they do next, this is where it actually doesn't. Again, from like what we've seen, it's not anything particularly novel. They have a lot of leeway, quite a bit of advantage just having a foothold within your network to begin with. And they will use sort of step through, again, a playbook of tried and true techniques, or tactics, techniques, procedures, known vulnerabilities in like VMware vCenter to get a service account, or Kerberos to get access to a service account. Like, we still see these sort of techniques, years on, to elevate privileges within a network. So it's certainly still, you still have an opportunity to detect them even at that phase. One one thing I will sort of draw attention to is and this is where we've seen organizations struggle a bit, is they're responding to an active intrusion by likely what's going to be a ransomware attack. And the ransomware operators will try to elevate their access. They will also distribute or create backdoors, both backdoor from a software perspective on systems, but they also create backdoor accounts. And it's can be difficult to identify all of that. So in terms of like your response, we do have to sort of do this, secular, we've kicked them out once, but we still need to watch for when they come back, because these guys will try and come back. And this is probably the most persistent they will be, is at that sort of middle phase, because they know they have access already and they want to. It's far easier to just try and wedge their way back in than it is to gain access all over again. So,
Right. Right. Yeah. So we've got a question in the comments here, asking about there's some laws around banning the ability to pay ransoms. Yeah, I kind of thought that would be a something that would be sorted at this point. But we even saw like MGM not pay the ransom and Caesars pay the ransom, and clearly they had very different results there. And I was doing some Googling while you were talking there, and it looks like a few state governments, it's illegal for them to pay ransoms. But beyond that, I don't know if you have any more data on this, but it doesn't look like there are any federal laws that have really made it much of anywhere.
yeah, there was something about banning the uh, proliferation or payments to known organizations. I'm forgetting the name of it now, but it's it's a balancing effort, because you want to, the way that this whole entire business model is eventually disrupted, or blown up, is you follow the money. Currently, it's too easy for these guys to get paid, and it's too difficult to track those payments and sort of disrupt them, or block them. It can be done. Obviously, law enforcement is getting better at that, and there are organizations that are focused entirely on tracking cryptocurrency transactions, even through like them getting cycled or washed. But as a regulator, I think that they're trying to strike a balance between not putting a victim in like a situation where they can't pay and get their return to business, when that's their only choice, right? And I'm sure there's loopholes around some of those things as well currently. So
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess it's interesting. Like, we're going to talk a little bit more about some practices that you can focus on to make it easier for you to withstand ransomware. But it does seem, given what you said, that they kind of have this um, metric for finding the perfect. It's funny with startups, we call it the ICP. When we're trying to decide who we're going to sell our product to, the ideal customer profile, and is almost like the crime equivalent of that, the ideal compromise profile, right? Somebody who's not sophisticated enough to do some of the stuff that we're going to talk about here, but has enough money to pay in a ransom to make it worth going after them, right? So
yeah.
hopefully those companies can do some of this stuff, and can follow some of the best practices and advice that we're going to go into here. But I do worry that they find that kind of perfect spot where maybe those folks aren't on a webinar like this.
Yeah, I think it's like, it's important to think too, when you think about how can we preemptively like prevent these attacks. I think it's important to understand like how they are choosing targets, and to expand on that point. Um, like threat actors today, they have multiple marketplaces that they can go to, and they can run fairly sophisticated searches to identify targets of interest from a extortion perspective. I like there was one case I recall, wasn't a case for our customers, but we were doing some research on, I think it was exploit forums, and we went into, they have a section on exploit forums for initial access auctions. So basically, threat actors they've gained some degree of access on it within an organization, and they want to monetize that access. they'll go to the forums and I think increasingly private chats, and they'll sell those or market those, and they'll market it using those things that we talked about, like the industry size, the revenue. So I recall seeing one for a U.S. telecom company with, forgetting the exact number off the top of my head. I believe it's in the report that's linked, but it was multi-million dollars worth of revenue. Um, and the access that was being sold was allegedly, they claimed, domain admin level access. So if you think about that from an effort perspective, uh, I don't need all the expertise in the world to know that for $5,000, which is what the sort of buy now price was for that access, I can pay that $5,000, VPN into that network, use that domain admin level access to turn everything off, kill the
Yeah.
backups, lock out all the accounts, steal the data, and then hand you the ransom note. That's, when we think of the revenue and what they'd probably ask in terms of a ransom, that's probably a pretty attractive ROI and certainly that's how threat actors are thinking about this when they choose targets.
Yeah, it's interesting that they've got, they're going to pay $5,000 or something, like getting initial access. This ecosystem of service providers, they're incentivized to get those payouts because they're having to pay in. They're having to make some investment here, and they need to make sure they recoup that investment, right?
Yeah. And these guys are increasingly finding creative ways to leverage those marketplaces as well. So think of like even just credentials. We're in the process of kind of putting together our year in review report, for basically what have we seen across all of our customer incidents in the last year, and sort of distilling that down to some kind of key points. One of the key takeaways from 2024 incidents that we saw was InfoStealer malware continues to be the most observed malware that we had detected across our customers. InfoStealers, the way they work basically is, they're going to target all the information on your system. They'll sell that. They'll turn around and sell that on marketplaces like Russian Market, for example. They might do it on Telegram. Luma Stealer, for example, like that. Luma was our most observed malware last year. They run their own marketplace. You can go into these marketplaces and you can search for particular access to services. So I think of Russian Market, I can go in there. It's almost like an Amazon.com type thing where I can search, hey,
Right.
show me all the logs for sale in the US for Gmail accounts, right? I could pay like $10 to get access to those accounts. Bringing it back to where I think
Or
there's been
maybe
some
pick a
innovation.
vertical, right? Like
Yeah.
manufacturing or something like that. Mhm.
So this brings back to like what we saw last year, which was the attack against Snowflake customers. So one of the lesson learned coming out of the Snowflake, that whole campaign, if you will, when Mandiant sort of did their after action review, they found, I believe it was like 80% of those accounts uh, were found on InfoStealer markets. So what I, you know, assess likely happened is this guy or this group went onto these markets, ran a search for Snowflake instances, pulled all the accounts back, and just started going through those one by one and pulling the data out of those accounts. So not so much as it initially was speculated, like a compromise of Snowflake, but really
Right. It
a
felt like it, right? It
yeah.
seemed like it.
Um,
Yeah.
it
But
was
it's
it
just a
was more
query.
so like exposure on those marketplaces, and somebody went, hey, wait, I can just run a search for this. Let me get all these accounts for a couple $100. I don't know exactly what they paid, and let me go leverage those. And I think certainly when we think of attacks that we might see in the coming years, I think we may see more of that, more of those sort of enterprising threat actors going onto these places and looking for new services that they can extort.
Well, and they're being efficient, right? They're finding something that works and just okay, like how many times can I do this and continue making it work? They don't have to learn a new technique or find a new source or something like that. Again, it reminds me a lot of how sales funnels and marketing funnels work, how companies get business.
Yeah.
Very, very similar habits and techniques here. Um, I just want to cover a couple things in the comments here. I feel like it's worth talking a little bit about triple, quadruple ransomware because it's defined differently by different people. Somebody included a link to how Checkpoint defines it, which they kind of define it as, okay, I can come back to you and ransom you again using some different leverage, some different methods. So maybe leaking the files, encrypting the files, then a DDoS attack or something like that. But I've also seen it applied to different parties you can ransom. So I hit a hospital, I can ransom the hospital. I can ransom the patients whose data I stole. I can ransom the hospital's partners. So I've also heard that referred to it as kind of triple ransom, where they can ransom all the different groups that are impacted, that would be impacted if they release the data.
Yeah, definitely. My concern when it comes to ransomware has always been like when it comes to the data theft and extortion, that is like uh, my concern has always been how do you know they're deleting that data truly? How do you know they're not warehousing that for a later point? And I certainly think there's opportunities down the road where, to your exact point, if you're like a psychiatrist's office that gets hit by ransomware, you pay a 60K ransom to for these guys to delete the data. Who's to say that group doesn't turn around in 5 years and sell those patient profiles to another threat actor who has the
Yeah.
time and wants to go poke each of those patients and go, "Hey, I'm going to release your confidential notes that you had with your therapist, unless you pay me 2 grand." So
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
kind of removes one of the concerns.
Yeah, and in I think it was Finland, we saw a company go out of business after that happened, and Vastamo, and it was like a chain of psychiatrists, and they did release the individuals like psych profiles and notes and stuff like that, which is I think one of the worst breaches that country has ever seen. Had big downstream impacts there. But yeah, it's a good point. Like, are you really going to trust them to delete the data if you pay, right? Like,
Yeah,
or maybe you
and
can trust
the other thing,
one
the other
member
thing
of the
too is like,
ransomware group, but not another. Yeah,
yeah, like you're these groups are sort of because they're not centralized, because you're not, the corporate entity, if you will, that's like setting the policies and procedures and how they will operate, like that's one group. But the the folks doing the intrusion, the folks handling the data, these are the affiliates. And who's to say these guys
yeah,
are abiding by that sort of that policy, if you will, like to actually delete it. Like there's just so many variables out there that it's difficult for me to fully believe that the data has been hasn't been sort of stowed away somewhere for future extortion.
and a few other. So another question and a good comment in the chat here. One of the attendees noted that. Uh, and earlier I mentioned there were a few state governments, where state government entities can't pay ransoms, and that was North Carolina and Florida. But also, good point made by one of the attendees in the chat that there have been some laws passed where you have to notify certain groups, government groups, if you're going to pay a ransom, or you could be in deep legal trouble if you don't notify.
Yeah, I think when we think of like regulations, um, part of the I think there's more like especially with the ransomware task force coming into play the last couple of years, like there's more of a effort to unify and harmonize, I guess, like the regulatory requirements or like what, especially when it comes to reporting. Part of the challenge that I think law enforcement has is is tracking those ransom payments through
Yeah.
the crypto blockchain, I guess. And I don't maybe, and someone in the chat can probably correct me, but as of yet, I don't think you are required, at least in the US,
Yeah.
to report ransom payment prior to it happening. You do
Yeah.
need
So,
to,
so yeah, I kind of misread the comment and misspoke there. There are proposals to do that. That look like
Yeah.
they haven't passed yet, the Ransom Disclosure Act and the Ransomware and Financial Stability Act. But what the commenter was talking about in the comments was, if those are on, the known terrorist list, the uh, OFAC list, I think it is, that you can download off government websites. That's basically a list of all known terrorists, or if it's a sanctioned country or something like that,
Yeah.
which is very tough. Like again, like, are you gonna take the ransomware crew at their word? You know, if you're not allowed to pay them, of course they're gonna say they're not on that list, or they're not
Yeah.
associated with them. So I don't know how that works. Like there's a good chance they're going to lie to you, and what do you do then?
Or they'll propose a middleman that's not affiliated or
Yeah,
not affiliated. In those situations, definitely, I would
and
I
they
would
get a cut.
defer to in-house legal counsel, right? Like, what's our exposure if we're going to make this payment? What is the risk versus like we had a business maybe if we don't make this, so we understand what we need to do here. So
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. And another question in there, is this still pretty much all Bitcoin in terms of the actual ransomware payments these days?
I don't have data on that, but in terms of payment types, it's still cryptocurrencies. Um,
Yeah.
and
I've
I
literally
think
personally, literally never heard of any other currency being used. I think mostly because Bitcoin has been one of the more reliable ones.
mhm,
And especially now that it's over 100K per Bitcoin, I can't imagine any incentive for using
yeah.
anything else, right? Like, as long as it keeps shooting up in value like that, that's just a bonus.
I think in the early days, we kind of looked at it. I remember with a colleague discussing this, like, the Bitcoin, it's a fleeting thing. It's not going to stick around. And was I completely wrong?
Yeah,
But yeah, the price
yeah,
definitely motivates keep using it. Certainly.
yeah. So kind of getting back to recommendations here, when I think about the stuff that you can do around ransomware, because ransomware is so broad, it's effectively like getting hit with a pen tester. It's hard to like look at any one thing and say, if you use this one weird trick, you can prevent ransomware, you can disrupt it or something like that. But I at least kind of think about preparation you can do, before you get hit with an attack. What you do during, so your incident response capabilities. And then, we find ourselves talking more and more, this is going to be a big buzzword, I think, in 2025, the rest of this year, about resilience, which is how quickly can we recover from it and get business operations back to normal. So, maybe, we talked a little bit about disrupting their playbook. Like, maybe let's move into the during the attack, incident response, and some of the suggestions you might have there.
Yeah, definitely visibility is incredibly important, not just during like the incident phase, but prior to the incident phase as well. So,
Detection
um,
capabilities.
well, like, so we have seen this. Um, we have some data around like unmanaged devices and the impact of those. But I would actually point to Microsoft's threat. I forget what they call it. Their threat report from last year. I think we had that in the handout. Hopefully, they had a stat in that report that just sort of pointed to like I think it was 80 to 90% of successful ransomware cases that they were involved with ultimately were traced back to unmanaged devices. And then that's
Mm,
an issue that we are seeing as well. So we are ideally, when we have full visibility into our customer environments, we're detecting the sort of pre-ransom, the sort of initial foothold phase, and we go, oh yeah, let's lock this down. It never progresses. Where we are having the biggest challenge, and I think this many organizations face this, is we'll get a detection for like an attack in progress. And we'll go, oh, where did this, how did we even get to this point? And we'll ultimately trace it back to an unmanaged network segment that we were never deployed to, or
yeah,
to a device, like a personal device that we never had a chance to, identify those initial steps. So I think as sort of a preparedness, but also in the middle of this, like, you need to understand, where are my gaps in detection, and because these guys are exploiting those, because they sort of get that first strike advantage. Um, if I were to sort of nail it down to like a couple of recommendations, a big one is around mobile device management and only allowing uh, compliant devices to access network resources. So you can talk about MFA and all that stuff, but like, these guys have gotten to the point where there's services out there that enable them uh, to defeat the weaker multi-factor authentication with like token replay attacks and that kind of stuff. If you implement MDM and you kind of restrict your access to compliant devices, you can really remove a big chunk of your risk and your exposure. Because from our data, from our stance, a lot of the more difficult attacks that we see are stem from unmanaged devices that we now have to try and run down and contain those.
So asset discovery, asset management. I do a lot of advisory calls with enterprises on that, and that seems like a perennial issue for enterprises. And we've seen a lot of attack surface management products out there as well. Trying to discover, those network segments you're not aware of. Maybe abandoned assets and stuff like that. So it seems like as an industry, we're kind of getting into a place where we're recognizing those problems and going after them. But another thing
There's so many
in the
tools, right?
category.
There's so many tools that we have to deploy, and we're giving it to different teams and different departments. Like, go deploy this thing and go deploy this, and it's part of the challenge is trying to centralize all that. Like, where are all our logs? Do we have multiple EDR products potentially, which we've seen? And who manages those?
Especially if you do a
Is it
bunch of acquisitions, companies that acquire
Exactly.
other companies. Yeah. And you've got
Yeah.
overlap and redundancy. Yeah.
So a number of times we've been in the middle of ransomware cases where we think we have it fully contained, um, and all of a sudden we see a connection from a backdoor admin account from a network segment that nobody even knew existed. So,
Yeah.
except for like one team, right? So they can
Yeah.
leverage the smallest little wedge openings and still wedge their way back in. So it's really important that you do that initial, make sure your scope of monitoring is adequate and covers
Yeah.
everything as much as possible. But during the incident phase, you are sort of continuously evaluating that, and you don't sort of stand down until you're comfortable that you've fully scoped it and kicked the adversary out of the network.
Yeah, I remember the last time I was building a security team on the enterprise side, way back in 2012. For whatever reason, just like a legacy political thing within the business, telecom managed all their own stuff. They managed their network, they managed their devices, and and when I came in, one of the things I did building the security team was a pen test, and I found that they had several NT4 servers back in 2012. Even in 2012, that was a long time to still have NT4 servers, and they're forever vulnerable to MSO8 067, which kind of like Eternal
Yeah.
Blue. Super easy with Metasploit, or a variety of different tools out there to exploit, and boom, you're on the domain. You can get domain admin pretty quick from that, and it's easy to see how this happens.
Yep, certainly. Um, I mean, to add another point to this, like, I get asked quite a bit about like dark web and where does it fit. Um, my response to that is, dark web monitoring as a capability is there to augment an existing mature program. It makes it makes a lot more sense to plug sort of the low hanging fruit issues that these groups are exploiting to gain access than it does to monitor the dark web for your CEO being mentioned or credentials being leaked. Where dark web monitoring as a capability is very helpful is identifying those blind spots. So identifying those personal devices that have been compromised by stealers, or even contractors at your service providers who have access
Yeah.
to your network resources, identifying those. And one point I would certainly stress with folks who do have a dark web monitoring service, go take a look at that and ensure that the keywords that you're looking for include your services. So not just like your domain name, but the actual services that you use. So if you have like Slack as like or your chat internal chat application,
Yeah.
typically Slack will use like an identifier for your business in the subdomain. So like for us, it could be like ecentaur.slack.com. Put that as a keyword
Yeah.
into your dark web monitoring service and ensure that um, you get a hit for that, because you will see, and we've done some digs on this for our customers, you will see like an MSP had access to some of these internal or cloud applications to manage your network, and unless you had explicitly set that keyword, you wouldn't see it. So
Yeah, yeah, that's how Lapsus got into EA, Electronic Arts. I think they bought a Slack key for like $10, Slack API key, and yeah,
yep.
I know a lot of businesses do that. Like Salesforce is one; they'll create like a C name for your business, where it'll be your business name dot salesforce.com. Yeah, Notion, tons of
Yes,
companies do that. Yeah.
I've seen looking at Russian market, say like what was for sale there. I recall seeing a single sign-on portal where the credentials are being sold for that account, and that single sign-on was a help desk service provider, and it listed all of basically remote access into all of their customers. So for
Mhm.
$10, which is what that was being sold for, that's a pretty good that's a pretty
Yeah.
good little little entry vector into like we refer to that as like amplification attacks, where you kind of go after a
Mhm.
service provider and then use that access to amplify the attack against more and more or a greater set of victims. So it's definitely, from a dark web monitoring, it's really important that you're considering like the third party risk component,
Yeah.
and that's one of the ways you can monitor for it.
Yeah, and just to make sure everybody knows what we're talking about with the way this stuff ends up on the dark web. Spence mentioned it earlier, but there's a type of malware called info stealers, and basically what they do when I think they started out really going after cryptocurrency and wallets and stuff like that. They're just trying to steal currency, but then they're like, while we're here, we might as well scoop up your all your logged in access tokens, OAuth tokens. You're logged into your email, you're logged into your Slack. We can just grab those tokens. Somebody can buy it, put it on their laptop. Boom, they're logged in as you. They don't have to go through MFA. They don't have to know your
Yeah,
password. It bypasses all the authentication controls, right?
yeah, yeah, definitely. And again, going back to that compliant device requirement, like that's a big way that you can sort of disrupt that. Is typically they'll use a donor system to try and uh, initiate that login. Um, so if you're restricting, you know, random machines from accessing your network, you can really limit that. So
All right, good stuff. Anything else, Spence? We had a lot of great questions from the audience. Thank you guys so much for the discussion there and the questions there. Before we wrap up, Spence, anything you want to leave people with? I love the very clear advice on find all your unmanaged stuff. Make an effort to go find those. Make sure you've got all the networks. I think one more, you've mentioned logs a lot of times. A lot of times logs are disabled by default, and you don't, I remember from my experience as a incident handler showing up, and you have no idea what happened, when, how they got in, because especially with some Microsoft stuff, uh, maybe it costs extra money to turn on the logs, or maybe you have to go in there and you have to manually enable them, or you only have some of the logs and you have to, they're not as detailed as you could have them, right? Any other suggestions like
100%.
that?
I mean, it comes to logs, definitely having those centralized and protected is extremely. Think of like crawl, walk, run. At the
Yeah.
running phase, you're monitoring everything, and you've got detections in place to like 24/7 detect some kind of weird connection. But we think of the response phase for most folks. The most important thing is like going back to the scoping this and understanding what's the scope and impact of this compromise. The logs is where you're going to find that answer. And if they've destroyed those logs or you've never had them turned on in the first place, that's going to be a difficult position to be in. So we think of preparedness. Certainly, that's going to be a core step of that preparedness phase, and making sure that you can exploit that telemetry as quickly as possible during an incident phase, or the IR firm that comes in has that available to them, that so that they can exploit that to expedite the response. I would say tabletop scenarios as well are incredibly useful for identifying gaps in ownership of who does what during an incident, even if that means who's going to call the IR firm. Do we have an IR firm on retainer?
Mm-hmm.
Who do we talk to get this rolling as quickly as possible? Because time is of the essence. The cost
Right.
to return to business increases the longer you're sort of treading water and trying to understand what to do. So build out that incident response plan. CISA has great templates and guides on that. If you do a Google search for that, as sort of like a bare minimum baseline. But run a tabletop scenario. Just talking through who does what, who owns
How do you
media,
use your insurance? Right? Like that's a big one. I've heard a lot of people like your insurance may dictate that you use a certain IR provider, right?
yeah,
You may not have
yeah,
a choice in who you use.
and we've come across that as well. I think the final point I would make here is just when it comes to ransomware, like from kind of the boots on the ground perspective, it is preventable. Like a lot of the innovation that we see is sort of front loaded in the early stages of the attack. And if you can identify and contain that, perfect, great. But it does require, quite a bit of rigor or expensive services to do that in certain cases. Where we don't see a ton of innovation is in that middle phase, where they are stepping through the playbooks that an affiliate has been given by a ransomware group. And if you have the telemetry and you have maybe some in-house expertise, or you've outsourced to a SOC or some kind of IR firm, like you can identify these guys and hopefully contain them. And we've been successful in that. And I think a lot of organizations as well. It's not a lost cause. That's what I'd end with.
All right. To answer one of these questions, yes, this webinar will be available for replay. It'll be on demand sometime after we complete here. I'm not sure exactly how much time it takes, but I think it's usually up later the same day or by the next day. You'll be able to go back to that same link and play it on demand. Good question. And I believe those handouts should still be there as well. If you haven't already grabbed those, make sure you grab some of the handouts here. We've got a lot of good stuff in there. And Spence has told you a lot of good stuff to Google. A lot of good references mentioned in here. Spence, this was a wealth of information. Very much appreciate you being with me today to go through the current state. I learned a lot in these. And I spent a lot of time talking to people about ransomware and reading ransomware reports. And I learned quite a few things today. So thank you for that.
Of course, happy to be here.
Also, thanks to our sponsor, eSentire, for making today's webcast possible. And finally, thanks to you, the audience, for joining us. Love to have these. Love to see you here. Love to see the activity in the comments. And we'll see you next time.